I'm so glad you guys are here today. I'm glad you stepped off the busyness of your own treadmill to be here so that we can worship together, reconnect with God's heart, and be prepared for the week ahead. And let me give a big shout out to those of you who are watching live online right now in coffee shops and living rooms and college dorms all over the place. Glad to have you guys with us. If you do live within a 20-minute drive of one of our campuses, we'd love to see you join us in person and get the full experience. If you live outside that area, maybe find some other folks, have a viewing party there with you. But everybody here in the room at our Dixon City campus, let's welcome those who are watching online right now. Make them feel a part of us. And this is a great week to be with us because today we're launching a brand new series. It's called Chasing Carrots, and we're going to be talking about this for about 5 weeks. But as we jump in today, let me explain the idea behind this series. This idea of chasing carrots goes back to the days when a farmer would dangle a carrot in front of a horse or a mule in order to motivate them. And the animal would literally be chasing the carrot, but as hard as it might work to actually get to the carrot, it's always just out of reach. Now, here's what I've discovered about us as human beings. We're not a whole lot smarter than donkeys. Our carrots are just more expensive. Like so many people go through life just chasing things that they think that if they can get it or get enough of it, it will ultimately satisfy them. But then they discover that's just an empty hope. It's an empty dream. And we get to the end of that pursuit and we are more hungry than we ever were before. This is a picture of the way that so many people go through life. I saw an example of this a few years ago. I was watching a video clip on YouTube where Jim Carrey was presenting an award at the Golden Globes. And as he came on stage to present the next award, before announcing the award, he spoke for a couple of minutes. And what he said was just shockingly honest. Here's what he said. He said, "I am two-time Golden Globe winner Jim Carrey. You know, when I go to sleep at night, I'm not just a guy going to sleep. I'm two-time Golden Globe winner Jim Carrey, going to get some well-needed shut-eye. And when I dream, I don't just dream any old dream. No, sir. I dream about being three-time Golden Globe winning actor Jim Carrey, because then it would be enough. It would finally be true. And I could stop this terrible search for what I know ultimately won't fulfill me." And the people in the crowd weren't sure whether to laugh at that or ponder that. But you know, it's not just wealthy Hollywood celebrities that go on that pursuit. All of us can go through life just chasing carrots. We chase the carrot of status into car dealerships and department stores. We chase the carrot of attractiveness and acceptance into gyms and plastic surgeons' offices. We chase the carrot of pleasure into websites and nightclubs and bars, and we chase after and chase after and chase after things that we believe will ultimately satisfy us if we can just get them or get enough of them. But we end up never quite being satisfied, and we end up just more empty at the end of that pursuit. And here's one of the worst things about chasing carrots. When we go through life, sometimes chasing after more and better and whatever the next thing is, sometimes we create bigger problems for ourselves because we chase those carrots into places that leave us trapped and empty and alone. I'll give you an illustration of this. There was a story in the news last year about an 18-month-old little guy by the name of Colin. And Colin was at a restaurant with his grandmother, and while they were waiting for a table, Colin spotted the claw machine. They're in the waiting area at the restaurant. And if you're a parent, you know what a claw machine is, right? It's this metal and glass enclosure. It's got all kinds of toys in it. And then you spend half your week's salary trying to maneuver the claw to get the toy to drop it down the chute. I've spent, I think, one of my kids' college educations on claw machines when they were little. But Colin sees the claw machine, and his grandma's not watching. He wanders over there, pushes open the door to the chute where the toys come out, and climbs up inside of it. And actually got stuck inside of it. They literally had to call the fire department to get little Colin out of the claw machine. But you gotta love the look on that kid's face, right? I mean, that is precious. And that's all of us. Because we pursue things that we think will satisfy us, and we pursue them sometimes to the point where we are trapped, where we're trapped in some kind of habit or addiction, where we're trapped in all kinds of financial stress, where we're trapped in a bad relationship. So we're going to talk about chasing carrots. We're going to talk about instead of chasing all the stuff that really doesn't truly satisfy us, what it means to chase the one thing that really will satisfy our hearts. And you know what? This is not a new problem, is it? This has been going on ever since the beginning of human history. In fact, 2,700 years ago, a Jewish prophet by the name of Isaiah was speaking to God's people, the people of Israel, because they had turned their hearts away from God, and they were chasing after other things instead of God. And Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 55, he gives this probing, powerful question. He says this, "Why spend money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, and eat what is good, and your soul will delight in the richest of fare." I mean, this is such an accurate description of the culture that we live in today, where we spend our money, we spend our time, we spend our energy pursuing things that we think will satisfy, and they don't, when all the while we just need to turn to the God who will give us the ultimate satisfaction for our souls. So that play money that was on your seat when you came in today, go ahead and take that out. I'm going to give you something to do with this at the end of the message, but I want you to hold that right now, and I want you to think about this question. Why spend money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? And let this represent not just your money, but your time, your energy, your passion, your labor. What are you spending all of that on? What are you giving yourself to? What are you chasing? And will it ultimately satisfy? Okay? So today, as we jump in, I'm going to go pretty deep, a little bit philosophical, somewhat theological, because I want to talk about the underlying spiritual struggle behind this phenomenon of chasing carrots. So I want to talk today about the biblical concept of idolatry. Now, idolatry is not a word that you hear very often, and it's not a very commonly understood concept in our culture today. But the idea of idolatry, it's one of the primary themes in Scripture. It's referenced over 1,000 times. And if you could peel back all the layers of our sin and our struggle and our dysfunction, I think at the very bottom of it all, in our hearts, you would find this: idolatry. Now, when I use the word idolatry, many of you are thinking, well, you know what, Mark? That may have been a problem hundreds of years ago. Because when we think idolatry, we think of ancient cultures and simple people bowing down to statues of stone and wood. And you think, well, that may have been a problem hundreds of years ago. But that's not a problem for me because, see, I live in the 21st century, and I'm smart, and I'm sophisticated, and so I don't practice idolatry. But here's what you need to understand. Whenever you read about idolatry in the Bible, you have to understand that it wasn't about the idol or the statue, it was about what was behind it. Because the false gods were always a means to an end. And these various gods, they held out the promises of power and wealth and comfort and fertility and a stable family, things that people wanted back then, things that all of us want today. And I believe that idolatry is alive and well in our culture today. We just dress it up in different clothes. So let me give you a definition here. Here's an idol. An idol is anything you look to and depend on to give you what only God can give. Anything that you look to and depend on to give you what only God can give. An idol is anything that promises a life of security and joy apart from God. What is the idol in your life? What are the idols in your life? What are those things that you look to and depend on too heavily? Now, here's the challenge with trying to identify the idols in our lives. The challenge sometimes is that idols aren't usually bad things. They're usually good things. They're good things that we turn into ultimate things. They're good things that we turn into God things. I'll give you some examples so you can kind of track with me. I'll take romance, for example. I mean, romance is a good thing. We are wired for relationship, and romantic love is a good thing, but this can become an idol in your life to the point where you say, you know what, I can never be happy until I meet that one right person. And until I meet that person who's going to love me romantically, then my life will be incomplete. It's kind of like that line from that 90s movie, Jerry Maguire, where Tom Cruise says, "You complete me." And this is the idea. When romance becomes an idol, this is the idea that your life will not be complete. You will never be happy until you find that one special person. And by the way, some of you have never seen that movie. I understand that. Just substitute any romantic comedy ever written, right? Because they all have the same plot, right? Two people meet who've never met before. They don't like each other. There's 2 hours of witty banter. Then they fall in love and get married. Like, they're all like that. Amen, guys? Can I get an amen? Yes. But the message is all the same. When you find that one person, then your life will be complete and you will be happy. And here's the problem with making romance an idol. When that becomes our God, then we will do anything to get it. And it's like the young Christian single girl who's dating a guy that everybody says you should not be dating him. He's bad news. He's not a guy you want to spend the rest of your life with. But she thinks probably he's the last train out of the station. And she says, you know what? He's good looking. I know he's not a Christian, but he's good looking. And he might become a Christian, but he couldn't become good looking. So I think I'm going to go ahead with this because I need to fill the emptiness in my heart. And so that becomes an idol. What about money? Money's a good thing. Money helps you provide for your family. Money helps us be generous with the poor. But money and possessions can easily shift into becoming not a good thing, but a God thing. When we look to money and possessions for our security, for our joy, when we begin to use that as a way to keep score and prove who we are, money can become an idol. How about success? Success is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. I mean, if you work hard and you do a good job, that can naturally lead to success. But sometimes success in and of itself can become our God. It can become our idol, and when that happens, we begin to compromise our integrity or compromise our family in the pursuit of the thing that we think will make us happy. So here's what an idol is. An idol is anything you look to and depend on to give you what only God can give. And sometimes those idols are good things that we've turned into ultimate things, into God things. Now, there's a passage in the Bible that I think addresses the subject of idolatry, what we call chasing carrots, head on. And it's in the book of Joshua, chapter 24. And just to give you a little bit of context, this particular book of the Bible is called Joshua because it's all about, who's the main character? Joshua. See how easy Bible study is? Yeah. Joshua was the leader of the people of Israel at this time. He had taken over for Moses, okay? And the people of Israel, the Jewish people, had just been on this long journey through the wilderness. They are now in the land that God had promised to give them. And so before they go off and begin their new life in this new land, Joshua gives them one final speech. And he lays down a challenge to them. Here's what he says, verse 14. He says, now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped. And the words worship and serve, they're used interchangeably in this passage. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are now living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua lays down 3 choices for the people. He says, listen, here are your choices. You can serve the gods your ancestors served. And that's what some of us do, right? We just kind of pick up the idols and the false gods that our parents served. You know, you worship success and work because that's what your parents did. You worship sports because that's what your dad worshiped. You worship alcohol because your mom was an alcoholic. Sometimes we just pick up the false gods that are handed down to us from our ancestors. Or he says you can worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. Sometimes we drift into worshiping the idols and the false gods of our world, the false idols of the culture in which we live. And he says, or the third choice, what I'm choosing and my household is going to choose, we will serve the Lord. And so Joshua says, listen, in the words of Bob Dylan, the famous theologian, you're going to have to serve somebody. Who are you going to serve? Who are you going to worship? You can worship the gods of your ancestors, the gods of the culture around you, or you can worship the Lord. Here's what I want you to notice. He doesn't give a fourth option. He doesn't say, or you can just worship no one. You can worship and serve nothing. That's not an option. I'll tell you why that's never an option. One very important truth as we talk about this subject: we all worship something. All of us. Our hearts are wired for worship. We all worship something. Now, sometimes when we hear the word worship, we think of what happens in a church building, right? We think worship is about robes and rituals and really old songs. That's worship. But if we take the word worship out of a religious context, here's what it means. It means this human reflex to try to center our lives around something. This human instinct to try to find hope and meaning and joy in something outside of ourselves. We lift something up and then we chase after it. You see, our hearts are wired for worship, and if we don't worship the one true God, we will fill our hearts with the worship of something else. I mean, just watch television commercials. I mean, every advertisement is marketing to the worshiper in us. They make their products sound like saviors. If you're unhappy or bored or depressed, buy this product, because this product will save you from your unhappiness, your boredom, or your depression. Our product is your redeemer, your deliverer, your savior. We all worship something. There was a fascinating book that came out about 9 years ago entitled Biology. And the book is all about the psychology behind marketing and purchasing in our culture today. And the author of the book describes an experiment that was done with 2,000 volunteers over a 3-year period. And what they did is they connected these 2,000 volunteers at different times to a machine that would register brain waves. And they would show them different brands and different logos, and they would watch which part of their brain would fire up. And then what they did, at the end of the experiment, they did something else very interesting. They also showed the same people pictures of religious figures or icons, and they discovered that the very same part of the brain would fire. Like, here's a quote from the book. There was no discernible difference between the way subjects' brains reacted to powerful brands and the way they reacted to religious icons and figures. We are built to worship something. This is why when you see a long line of people outside of a store waiting for the newest iPhone, that is a worship gathering right there. We all worship something. If your worship is not directed toward God, it will be directed towards something else. We're looking for something to give us meaning and hope and security in this world today. And so Joshua says to the people of Israel, you got to choose. Who are you going to worship? Because we all worship something. And then here's how they respond, verse 16. Then the people answered, far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods, small g. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our fathers up out of Egypt from that land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too, just like you, Joshua, we too will serve the Lord because he is our God. Of course they say we're going to serve the Lord. After what we've seen, after what we've experienced, how could we not serve the Lord? We are with you 100%. And at that point, they have the very best of intentions. But their commitment was rather short-lived. And their hearts begin to drift. It's kind of like this note that I came across from a little boy to a little girl named Ashley. It says, Dear Ashley, would you please be my girlfriend? I like you a lot. P.S. Please put yes, no, or maybe. And she circles no. But at the bottom of the note, she writes something else. She says, I'm sorry, I already have a boyfriend, Kyle, but when we break up, you're my next choice. And I love the P.S. That will probably be a month or two. Like this girl, Ashley, she got it figured out, right? I'm going to grow tired of this guy eventually, so I better keep a list going here. It's probably going to be a month or two, you know. The people of Israel said, Joshua, we are with you. How could we not serve and worship the Lord our God? But then, over time, they grew tired of that, and their hearts began to drift. Pick up the story in the next book of the Bible. It continues in the book of Judges in chapter 2. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and all who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. So far, so good. People are living in the land. They're serving the Lord. They're growing their families. Things are going well. Life is really good, and it would be great if the story ended there. But it doesn't. Skip ahead to verse 10. After that whole generation, that would be Joshua and the other elders, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, that means they all passed away. After they were gone, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. This is kind of a different message for another time. There's a problem here. They didn't hand off their faith to the next generation. They got so busy with life. And they were so preoccupied with the activities of life that they never took the time to pass on to the next generation the faith that they had in their hearts. Fall retreat next weekend, if you got kids in grades 6 through 12, okay? Practical application. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And this is what happened then. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They got busy. They got complacent. Their hearts began to drift, and their attention began to drift. It says they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. This is what makes this so heartbreaking. They turned their backs on the very God who had rescued them, the God who had parted the Red Sea, the God who had miraculously fed them in the wilderness, the God who had given them their freedom, given them a future, the God who had fought their battles for them. This is the God they forsook. This would be like Prince Charming finding Snow White, giving her a kiss and waking her up, bringing her back to life, and then she runs off with Dopey. That's what this was. Because here's what they did. They followed, and what's the next word? And worshiped. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. Here's where the story goes from there. At this point, this began a downward spiral in the nation of Israel. Their lives began to fall apart. Their nation lost power. Enemy nations invaded because they had walked away from God's heart. They had also walked away from his hand of protection. And they lived in oppression and pain for years. Eventually, they would come to the point of repentance and cry out to God for forgiveness. He would forgive them immediately, take them back, but then they would drift again. And this cycle repeated itself over and over and over, and it got worse and worse and worse. And about that time, another Jewish prophet comes on the scene. His name was Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet. You're in church. Jeremiah was a prophet, a Jewish prophet, okay? And he was known as the weeping prophet because his heart was so broken over what he saw in his nation and the condition of the people. And in Jeremiah 2, and God is speaking through Jeremiah, his prophet, to the people of Israel. He says this, "My people have committed 2 sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." You know, in ancient Israel, there were basically 2 sources of water. There was what they called living water, which was water that would come from a spring or a stream. And they called it living water because it was moving and fresh, and it was clean, and it was healthy. But if you didn't have access to that kind of water, to living water, the only other thing you could do is collect rainwater. And the way you would collect rainwater is by creating a cistern. You would dig a hole and line it with stone, and then put plaster inside of it to seal it up. But water in a cistern would often be stagnant. It would be stale. Animals would fall into it and die. It would be corrupted and polluted. Eventually, the plaster would begin to leak. And so any thinking person, any rational person in that day, if given the choice, would rather drink from a spring of living water than drink from a cistern. And yet God says, my people are doing what is irrational. They have rejected and forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that can't even hold water. In other words, they were trying to quench the spiritual thirst of their hearts with things that would never quench that thirst. And we face the same 2 options today, every single day, every human being. We can reach out to the living water that God offers, or you can just drink from the polluted pools of this world. And there are millions of people who every day are trying to find refreshment in the polluted ponds of pleasure and money and beauty and fame and all the things that this world offers that we think will quench our souls, but it really won't. When all the time God is saying, come to me, come to me. I'll give you refreshment. I'll give you satisfaction. I'll lead you toward peace. I'll lead you toward wholeness. I had a conversation years ago with a young lady who had just made some really poor choices, and she was facing some pretty significant consequences because of that. And she said, and I'll never forget this, she said, Mark, why is God doing this to me? And I tried to say as gently as I could, God isn't doing this to you. He gave you the freedom to choose, and you chose to walk a different path. You chose to drink from a different source. You chose to worship a false god. And these are simply the consequences. So let me go back to that verse where we began, Isaiah chapter 55. Why spend money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? Take out that play money again. I want to ask you to do something as you think about this. This statement, if Isaiah were here today, he would ask us the same thing. He would ask Americans the same thing. Why are you spending money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? Why are you running after all these things? So again, this represents not just our time, it represents our energy, our money, represents the wholeness of who we are. So what are you giving yourself to? What are you running after? What are you spending yourself for? I want you to do a little bit of personal inventory, and here's what you can do. There's a pen on your seat as well, and you can take that pen and either right now or before you leave or when you get home, jot down some of the idols or potential idols in your heart. The things that you have the tendency to spend yourself on that probably will bring no return on that investment. So let me give you some diagnostic questions, okay? Because this is hard to figure out sometimes. So I want to give you 5 questions that help us to unmask some of the idols in our hearts. These are very personal questions, but I think a very powerful exercise. Here's the first question. What are your dreams? You know, it's a really good thing to have dreams. It's good to have goals. It's good to have aspirations. But here's the question. Why do you aspire to those things? Do you aspire to those things that you dream about because you want to be the best person that you can be for God's glory, to serve Him and to serve others? Or is it all about your own glory, your own fame, your own prosperity? What are your dreams? And what's the motive behind them? Does that indicate perhaps an idol, a false god in your life? Here's the opposite question. What are your disappointments? What are your disappointments? Because I've discovered that whenever we experience overwhelming disappointment in our lives, it may be that it's pulling back the curtain on our hearts and revealing something that was too important to us. When we face disappointment, it's always good to ask the question, have I put too much hope in something other than God? I like what Brendan Manning said in his book, The Importance of Being Foolish. He said, to ascertain where your affections are, recall what saddened you this past month. Was it the realization that you do not love Jesus enough, that you did not care for His people enough? Or did you get depressed over a lack of respect, criticism from an authority figure, your finances, a lack of friends, fears about the future, or your bulging waistline? And then conversely, he says, what delighted you this past month? The afternoon you stole away for 2 hours with only the Bible as your companion? A small victory over selfishness? Or were the sources of your joy a new car, a Brooks Brothers suit, a great date, great sex, a raise, or a loss of 4 inches from your waistline? What are your disappointments? What are your discouragements? That may be an indicator where some of the idols might begin to be cropping up in your heart. Third, where do you run when you're hurt? Where do you run when you're hurt? Let's suppose you have a terrible day at work, okay? So you get home from work, what do? Do you go to the freezer and drown your sorrows in a half-gallon of Rocky Road ice cream? Do you go to the mall for several hours of retail therapy? Do you go to the liquor cabinet? Do you go to Netflix and binge a TV show for 4 or 5 hours? Do you go on the internet and go into some of the darkest corners of the web? Where do you run when you're hurt? I like what Henry Blackaby says about what an idol is. He says an idol is anything you turn to for help when God told you to turn to Him for help. Where do you run when you're hurt? Question number 4, what makes you angry? What makes you angry? Okay, so maybe you get angry when someone, let's say, just for purposes of an example, cuts you off in traffic. Like you're that kind of person who gets angry at really bad drivers because you're like me, you're an excellent driver and everybody else is a terrible driver and they cut you off in traffic and you get angry and you hit the horn, you hit the roof and you're very tempted to use hand signals and all of that. Maybe that's an indication that there's an idol in your heart and that idol is respect and you just felt disrespected. That made you angry. Maybe you get angry at your favorite sports team, and maybe that's an indication that perhaps sports have become a false god in your life. Maybe you get angry about politics. You know, I believe that the reason why politics has become so divisive in our culture is because we have replaced a belief in God with a belief in political saviors. And so now we pursue politics with what was religious fervor years ago. Because politicians and political parties have become our functional saviors because we don't really believe that God can meet the deepest needs of our hearts and our culture anymore. And so we worship politics, and that's why we get angry about it. What makes you angry? What makes you angry? One more question. Isn't this fun? One more question for introspection. What are you sacrificing for? Because idols will always make you sacrifice for them. If acceptance is your idol, you'll be tempted to sacrifice your honesty just to get the approval of other people. When personal comfort is your idol, you're going to avoid anything that makes you uncomfortable. And so instead of giving your time to serve other people, instead of giving your resources to be generous to the work of God's kingdom, you keep those things and you say, no, I can't do that because these are my offerings that I give to my God, the false god of comfort. If success is your idol, you may have to sacrifice your integrity or your family in your pursuit of that idol. You know, it's interesting, if you read the Bible, you discover that some of the nations, the pagan nations surrounding Israel, would actually literally sacrifice their children to a false god called Molech. And you read that and you think, how could any parent ever do that? And then you think about it for about 2 minutes and you realize that today there are parents who are sacrificing their kids to false gods, like the false god of success, because you don't think your life can have meaning without success. And so if your kids get in the way with that, well, you just push them aside and you make that sacrifice for what your God really is. So here's what I want you to do. Wrestle with those 5 questions. Think about your own life, your own heart. What are the carrots you tend to chase? What are the idols that you tend to worship? And begin to identify those. And then in the weeks to come, we're going to get very specific on a few of them, probably some that you might even write down. But let me go back to Isaiah 55 one more time. Why spend money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? God says, listen to me and eat what is good, and your soul will delight in the richest of fare. These last few minutes, we're going to end with one more song together. It's an opportunity for us to both declare to God and to remind ourselves that our ultimate satisfaction, our deepest thirst, will never be satisfied in all the stuff of this world. That the place we find our ultimate joy and satisfaction and hope is never in the things of this world, but only in the God who created this world. He is the fountain we drink from. As the band is coming, setting up, just watch this with me.